Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited to be joining you again on Thursday at 3 p.m. Central to talk about my favorite thing, machine quilting. And before we get into this week's video tutorials, this week's challenge, I actually have a giveaway this week for you. So from time to time on my live chats, I like to reward those of you that watch live or watch throughout the week because I do appreciate the support. And I've got a giveaway just for you guys. So I have a dear friend, her name's Tina, and she has started a subscription box, and I talked her out of one of them to give away. So it's a cherry wood box with the cherry wood hand-dyed fabrics. I don't know if you've ever tried it, and a pattern and some other goodies, and one lucky quilter is going to get this. All you have to do is leave a comment on this video letting me know which of the designs during the Free Motion Challenge fillers has been your favorite, and I'll pick a lucky winner before next week's live chat. And if you want more information about the subscription box, you can check the link in the description box below. So leave a comment and good luck. I hope you get it. Well, this week in the Fillers Free Motion Challenge, we kind of left behind the swirls and we left behind the geometric, and we kind of switched it up with what I called my favorite fillers. Now, originally I had put this as like the pointy fillers, but these are just the rest of the fillers that didn't fit any of the other categories. But that doesn't mean they're not amazing, because they are. And so we're seeing everything from smooth clamshells to bricks. You know, we're going to see a feather meander or feather filler here in a little bit. So I'm super excited about this week. For those of you that, you know, maybe you want a little bit more an assortment to stay a little bit more engaged, hopefully you have enjoyed it. So the video just came out yesterday, and that one had 4 of the designs. And then I just got another video out right before I went live with 3 more. So I will be adding those missing designs as we work our way through. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Let's go over some of the pictures and some of the designs that we have learned or will be seeing pretty quickly. And if you're watching live, you can leave your questions in the type chat, because Jessica, as always, is behind the camera monitoring the chat, writing those down so I can answer them live for you, because I want to make sure you have everything that you need to be successful with the designs that we're working through. So let's talk about some of our favorite filler designs. We kind of started off this video with leaves and paisleys, and we'll see that here again in a little bit. But I will tell you, for this challenge, it's been kind of not daunting. It's been a good exercise in graphic design. I've been working on those quilting diagrams, the free tip sheet, and the expanded resource. Those things are bigger than they have ever been, and this time is no different. It's huge. So anyway, if you need a little bit extra help with any of those designs, please take advantage of either one. The free diagrams still have multiple pictures and diagrams, or the expanded resource, which has even more step-by-step. Okay, so we started off with the Leafy meander, and there's been probably a handful of designs within this challenge that we have already seen at least once throughout the different Free Motion Challenge quilting alongs, and the Leafy meander is, no exemption to that. We saw that in the Flora and Foliage challenge, and we also saw that in the very first challenge. But like I said, I want this to be a sampler of all of our favorite designs, so we're going to see some of those favorites over and over again. I didn't spend too much time on this because you can always check out those previous videos. But when we're talking about fillers, I really want all the designs to go in a bunch of different ways, because I want that overall texture. And I know I say that a lot in the videos, and sometimes as I'm editing, I'm like, good Lord, Angela, stop repeating yourself. But it is very important. When we are putting a design around something else to show it off, we don't want the design to draw too much attention to itself. So we can use the Leafy meander to create, directional designs, or we can create these elements. But for here, we're really just want to quilt in all different directions. And so as you're working your way around, getting comfortable with that shape. Now, the first one, let me go back real quick. The first one is the previously quilted sample, so you can see a little bit of the echoing, a little bit smaller. But this next picture is one I quilted while filming, so a little bit bigger, a little bit less dense. I think that's something to keep reiterating for all of my free motion quilters out there. You can take any design and you can make it as dense or as light as you like. So if you see something you love, but you don't love it quilted to death like I have done it, you can definitely spread those lines out. You're going to get that same texture. Let's see, if this was like a drinking game, how many times do I say texture in a video? But you still get that same texture and that same look without the density and the time investment. And then we kind of went to the Paisleys, and those two are just so similar in the way they go together. A little bit different in shape. The Paisley has that rounded edge, not the pointy, but that's the only difference. And I love this for more feminine quilts. And I kind of put that in quotes because, I mean, what makes one quilt more feminine than the other. Just something that has flowers or softer shapes, or when I don't want something so angular, so pointy. One thing I mentioned in the tutorial that I didn't really drive home is I don't necessarily quilt mine straight up. So my Paisleys tend to flop over a bit because that's just how I like how they look. But as you're working through any of these designs or any designs that I show, just know that how I quilted is just my handwriting or my quilting style. As you develop your own, you're just going to lean into that, right? So don't force yourself to quilt it one way if you find it naturally flows the other. So whether you quilt your Paisleys to the side or straight up and down, it's still going to look great on your quilts. Now we did see the pea pods design, and this is a design that was in one of my earlier books. I think it was Shape by Shape Quilting. And this is one I teach in my classes, but I don't think I've done a tutorial on this. And what's really fun about this is we're starting to see the combining designs where we're using the quilting to create an element, and then we're filling around that design with another filler. So it's kind of ironic, right? We're filling in the filler, but what we're doing here is just going for those subtle pops of texture. In an earlier live chat, when I talked about the things that, the effects that fillers can create on your quilt, texture was one and adding interest is another. And so this just adds a little bit of interest with that slight different shape, that slight contrast. It's just gonna draw attention to it slightly differently. But what's great about this is you can make this as complex or as easy as you'd like. So even though I filled my pods with pebbles, and even though I quilted them a little bit smaller, there are some easier variations. So as you're working with these designs, I hope that you feel inspired or encouraged to come up with your own variations, because I think you're gonna love them as much as I do. This is one of the variations right here where I left out the filler, just added another little line on the inside and quilted the swirls around it. So again, just a pop of interest, just a little different there. The little pointy area where the threads come together is just going to give it a slightly different look. And it's funny because if you think about the first two designs in the challenge, the Leafy and the Paisley, I'm like, don't make the lines touch. We don't want thread buildup. We don't want to draw attention. Well, now I'm like, forget that. It's fine. The lines are going to come together. And this is a perfect example looking at it. What happens when your quilting gets closer together? It just draws attention to that area. This time, we're just being intentional about it. So you can quilt it without the filler, still get that cool look. And as a little aside, now this isn't in the diagrams or the tutorial, if you're struggling with the serpentine line, this is built off that shape, but without the pressure of having to make it perfect. So this might be a good practice as you're trying to learn that shape and that design. Excuse me. And as for all the tutorials, for most of them, I quilt them on the long arm as well, so sewing machine and long arm. And this is just an example of quilting that same filler, that pea pod with leaves and those little pods. Those are more similar in shape, right? They're more similar in the way that the point there, so those pods aren't going to show up as much. So just like we've seen prior to this, what you put around a design is just as important as the design itself. It's going to determine what's going to show up and what's going to hide. So just a little example there. Now, you can also quilt your pods so that they go in a direction. So we're kind of like looking at other applications of this shape. And I wished so bad that I had time to grab out this quilt. I made a big quilt that said Legacy on it. It's just ginormous, but I quilted pods on it so that they kind of radiated from the center. Now, I know you can't see that because it's in my brain, but just imagine it looked really cool. So you can be intentional about the direction of those pods to create different effects, whether they create a line that moves along the quilt or rotates around something, or maybe you just throw in pods around the main element of the quilt. So play around with that. I think at first glance you might think, it's not really worth it, but it really is a good design to use. Then for this tutorial, we saw combining designs. And I kind of jokingly call this improv quilting. It's just a fun way, first of all, to stay engaged while you're quilting. I'm so easily bored, but I'm easily amused, so it all works out. And I love combining different designs to create yet another texture, another design. It's also a great practice on using, filling in gaps as you go. It's a great practice at introducing new designs that you don't want to commit to using over a whole area, right? Maybe you know how to quilt swirls and flowers, but pebbles are the ones that are just, a little scary. Well, we can introduce them in little bits and kind of tiptoe into it. So we already kind of saw this with the swirls when we talked about combining swirls and pebbles, but here we're just throwing in a lot more designs. And in the video, I say, Sometimes I'm asked, can you have too many designs on a quilt? And I'm sure you can. I've just never seen it happen. I think you can have a lot of different designs on your quilt, especially if you're quilting them all the similar density so that one isn't overshadowing the other, and using a matching thread color. So that's going to help you if you don't want the quilting to be like, hey, look at me. Even though in the tutorials I'm using a contrasting thread, that's so you can see what I'm doing. That's kind of important. But if I were doing this technique on a quilt that I wanted to have that subtle interest, that beautiful texture, I would definitely use a thread color that blends in. So as you're working through your designs, don't overthink it. If you're combining them, you don't have to have the same ratio of each. You don't have to use a design more than once. If you quilt it once, you don't love it, then leave it, move on. And I always think this would be a fun game to play if you have other quilters. Have them yell out designs to you while you're quilting. Might be kind of a fun practice. So combining designs, and then I demonstrate that on the long arm. And I think what's interesting, and it's hard to see with this whole piece of fabric here, one of the neurotic tendencies that I tend to have, besides I don't have perfectionism, but I do have this thing where I hate leaving unquilted areas just because I'm used to doing it. So as I'm demonstrating on the long arm, I'm flowing from one to the next to the next. So even within the designs that we're practicing, I'm combining them. And again, just making sure that all the gaps are filled in. But what's great about that is when you look at this picture and you step back, even if one pebble wasn't right or the leaves weren't perfect, all you see is that whole overall texture. So you have to kind of keep going until you see that whole finished element. All right, so then that video came out yesterday, so that was the first 4, and then today's video has the next 3 for this week. And we're talking about clamshell shapes and variations. And these are the ones that aren't going to be your most versatile designs, right? They're not going to be the most used designs for me on my quilts, but when I need that right design, right, it's perfect. So it's like the relief pitcher that comes in and throws those 3 strikes and gets it out for you or whatever. And so these are fun ones that you might look at and be like, I don't know, but I'm telling you, someday along the line, you're going to come across a quilt and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, that would be perfect. Well, clamshells are a very, classic design. And when we talk about clamshells, usually they're quilted over just those arcs over the whole area. Very common hand quilting design, or even, machine quilting as well. But one of my struggles with that is I don't do well with connecting them or continuing it through the whole area, because what happens, they tend to get smaller, I tend to get off track. Or especially when I'm doing this on a long arm, I can't necessarily start from the bottom, so I've got to kind of rake it up a little bit. So combining them with other designs is just so much fun. I'm, like I said, so easily amused, and this design amuses me to no end. So I love to make my little pops of those clamshells, those little clusters, and then fill in around it. And we've actually seen this technique slightly differently in the rulers challenge, where we used clamshell rulers and wavy rulers to do this. But now we're just using free motion quilting. Some questions that get asked a lot or continually throughout this is about the scale of the designs. If I'm freehanding my clamshells, I'm keeping them pretty small. I mean, they're probably about 1 inch wide. It's very hard to sustain a big curve consistently, so I keep them on the smaller side. So this is definitely going to be somewhere a little bit more dense, something where I want a little bit more interest, not necessarily my busier fabrics or where you can't see it. So I kind of talked through how you start with your first couple rows of your clamshells, should you want to do it that way, and then how you can cluster them together just by backtracking over it, and then filling in the gaps. I just did basic clamshells with this, but there are so many clamshell variations that you could combine with it. It's like a never-ending story there, so you can have fun with it. And then on the long arm, I kind of showed how you can incorporate several clusters. And as I'm quilting this technique, and this is one that's great for nature-inspired quilts. I've done this for Tula on her big anchor quilt. It's fun on novelty quilts. Maybe not necessarily for traditional quilts, but I could see it working in some places, but it's just definitely fun. But as I'm working my way through, I'm not even like, oh, I have the same amount of clusters over here as I do over here, or I've got 5 over here. I'm just quilting them as it pops in my head, as I see fit. So don't overthink it. I know that especially as you're learning a design or a technique, it can be kind of scary, but you have to just, trust that it's going to be fine when it's all done. And what's even great, even better about this is when you're done and you're using a matching thread color, which I know this contrasts, what stands out is the unquilted area in the clamshells. That is the pop that you get, that texture. So the filler isn't going to be the main star. And so if you're practicing your swirls or you're struggling with a design, that's a great one to put around it because it's going to kind of fade to the background anyway. This is one that I love to use, especially like I said, tonal fabrics, solid fabrics, more modern quilts, nature-inspired quilts, or as a centerpiece. This particular quilt has a lot of borders around it, and I just kind of threw this in the center, and it's kind of just like combining designs, right? I have other designs around it, some flowers and some pebbles. So it just shows you how far you can take this once you get the hang of the technique. But you know the drill, right? If you've watched any of my videos, you've already heard this. The most important thing is that you fill in the area as completely as possible and fill in any of those gaps, and when you're done, you're gonna have a really interesting design. All right, so then we saw the bricks design, and this was one that I had to incorporate because it's one of those specialized designs, but it really works great if you have pictorial quilts, landscape quilts, panels, perfect for that. A house quilt, I know that was kind of the trend last year. It feels like a bunch of quilts with houses on it, great for shingles and those kind of shapes that you have. But it tends to also be an easier shape to quilt compared to the clamshell. Probably because clamshell is a half circle, so if that half circle isn't symmetrical or right, it's going to be noticeable, kind of. But who says that the bricks have to be all the same size? Who says that it can't be kind of rounded on the corners? This one is a little bit more abstract. So we're taking that shape and we're just rounding off the corners or making it a little boxier, and we're filling in the area. So if you're just trying to get the idea of quilting rows of designs on top of each other, how to offset them, travel along the edge, this is going to be a great one for beginners. But again, it can be used in a lot of different ways. And one of the fun things I was playing around with when I'm thinking of designs, how can I change them up? How can I use them in different ways? I've said this several times before, but it's so much easier to learn a lot of different ways to quilt a design than it is to learn so many different designs. So one of the variations I showed on this one is intentionally making those bricks different sizes, different widths, different heights, and it's going to give me a more wonky, kind of more fun, whimsical look. Again, not the one you're going to use all the time, but every once in a while, it's going to be great. Plus, it just shows that if you're struggling with keeping the design all the same size, if you're just intentional about really changing it up, it can just be a new variation. And so, again, this is just a different way to use that. Now, when I talk about adding interest to quilts or detail, this quilt is exactly what pops in my head. And I wish I had a better picture. I'm going to show you closer. It's a little blurry, but I still had to include it. So this particular quilt I always feature in my Help How Do I Quilt It trunk show when I travel, because it's a perfect example of how the inspiration of the quilt can guide your quilting decisions. So when Tula gave me this quilt, to me it looked like ski tips or something else, and she said, no, it's supposed to look like Gothic arches. I'm like, okay, well, Gothic arches, that's totally different. I got to pick some different designs, maybe not elongated swirls that look like wind. And I end up using that brick design in the background of some of those arches. So in the video, I say it's great behind blocks, not necessarily very irregularly shaped blocks. I mean, you can do it. It's just going to be a little bit more thinking. But this is a perfect example, adding a little area in behind the blocks, just adding a bit of detail, adding that nice texture, and moving on. And so, like I said, not every quilt, but you're going to definitely come across some that you're going to love it on. And then the video, the one that just came out, I finished up with the basket weave design, where we take the clamshell, same shape, and we just incorporate a little bit of traveling to give us a different texture. Whether we make each of the rows the same size, but don't worry about echoing, or incorporate echoing, either one's going to give it that cool effect. You can see the difference. The bottom of the block they're all kind of the same size. As we get to the top, they're a little more uniformed. Either one is great. And again, so forgiving, because who says that that's what a basket weave is supposed to look like or isn't? So it's not quite your clamshell with your recognizable shape. Again, this is going to be something for smaller areas, definitely to add a little bit of detail. That traveling is going to make it take a little bit longer, so it's not going to be something I'm going to do over the whole quilt. But if you wanted to, and I didn't say this in the diagrams or the video, this is a great border design as well, or sashing. So you can really have fun with that and use it to add that texture, I'll say it again, that texture or that slightly different look. And if you notice, if you look at the top where I have my travel lines, they're not perfectly on top of each other. Each travel line isn't perfect. It still gives me that same look. And I can point out my mistakes because that's my job. I don't want you pointing out your mistakes, but I just want to show you this was me trying because I knew I would be using it in the video. So the idea is we're going to have that unquilted area show up, that beautiful texture, even if those travel lines aren't perfect. Then this video is the one I'm working on. Hopefully it will be out very soon. It's the feather filler. So we're taking feathers and we're using it as a filler for bigger areas. Now, It's kind of funny because I've shown all these designs and not a feather. That's weird because I love feathers. Well, here we're creating a design that's somewhere between a meander and a motif. It's not quite like a overall just texture, but it's not like, hey, look at me, a motif. It's kind of in between. And so you're going to see how you can create that shape in different directions just to create a interest and practice that shape without committing to using it in a border or a block or somewhere kind of scary. And then lastly, the next one that we'll see is the Starburst design. Now we've actually already seen this in a previous challenge. Again, this was in the rulers challenge, except this time I'm freehanding it. We're not going to use a ruler to create that. So you can check out that video if you want to see how it goes together. This is such a fun design because depending on the type of quilt you put it on, it's going to look like different things. Right here, it looks like a starburst or barbed wire, but depending on if it's a fireworks quilt, then it can look like firecrackers. If it's on a snow quilt or a Christmas quilt, it can look like snowflakes. It can look like grass. It can look like a lot of different things. So really fun texture and interest for a less dense look. It does have a little traveling on that starburst, but we're just going to get it as close as we can, knowing when we're done, it's going to be fine. So we'll see that tutorial come out soon. But here you can see some of the quilting I did for that. That first row is the regular one. Second row is just the tops. To me, that can look like grass if you're doing a nature-inspired quilt, because believe it or not, grass is actually hard to quilt. If you've ever tried it, it's not easy. So this would be something I would use for grass, or you can do some curvies, little shapes to give it a softer look, to maybe look like butterflies or things like that. Or you can combine it with wavy lines just for a cute little look. So really, I mean, depending on what it's on, it can look like different things. Another thing, it could look like spiders, but we won't say that because sometimes that's a little scary. This is a design that I love to use in bigger areas because it does need two defined edges. So it needs like the sides of the quilt or two other quilting designs, but it really does just adds a nice contrast. And especially in this quilt where you have all these curvy motifs, just putting that bit of geometric, that starburst in the center and the top just really, I think, looks good. Of course, I think it looks good because I quilted it. So those are the designs that we're going to be working through this week. Now, I know that we're covering a lot of ground. I told somebody on Monday, I said, I bit off more than I can chew, and I'm still chewing on it. But I think it's worth it because as we're seeing these different designs, it's kind of stretching us in different ways. And then you can find the ones that you like that you're going to use in a lot of different ways. So please do not be intimidated or overwhelmed or just like, oh, I can't even get started because there's so many. Just pick one and try it. And even if you just try one from each week, well, then you'll have 5 fillers to add to your repertoire. All right, Jessica, we have any questions? I see you over there writing furiously. One of these days we'll get a better routine where you don't have to like scribble, but your handwriting is very clean, so it's good. I seem to quilt too fast on my long arm. Can you help? My alarm keeps going off on my machine. Is that a problem? Okay, so I'm assuming you're talking about the overspeed alarm. If you're in a stitch regulator for some machines, I don't know, can't speak to all of them, but especially Handy Quilter, since I'm a dealer, I know about those. For machines that don't have as powerful of a motor, sometimes it can't keep up with the speed that you're quilting and the stitches per inch that you want to create. That little alarm when I'm demoing at the shop on the other machines always goes off because I'm overrunning. My hands are moving the machine faster than the motor can keep up with the stitches. For those of you who don't have a long arm, you can just tune out for just a second. But if that's happening, you might want to go into manual mode. Maybe it's time to turn off the stitch regulator and just put it in manual. And what will happen there is when you turn the button on, the machine is going to quilt the same speed no matter how fast or slow you move it. That means your stitches might be a little organic, a little different in length, but you're going to have that nice movement without that overspeed alarm. Another thing that you can do is you can do less stitches per inch. So if you're doing some of the bigger, wavier lines where you're moving quicker, you can probably get away with 10 stitches per inch, 10 or 11, and that's so the machine doesn't have to work as hard to keep up with you. So those are 2 options for you. Hopefully that helps. On the last video, I used a white pounce pad on white fabric. Did I need a special light to do that? I didn't. Isn't that crazy? It actually isn't white fabric. It's a light tan. So the video, it kind of washed it out a little bit, looked white, but so that's why you can see it. But I will say on the pounce pad, it's like a chalk pad that you rub on your stencil to quickly mark reference lines. They make other colors as well, so there's blue and pink too. So if you need a color that stands out a little bit more, I always try to use the lightest color I can use. So I try to use white unless I absolutely cannot see it because I just want to be able to wipe it off real quick. Do I use this level of detail on a print fabric? Most often not, but it depends. If I'm quilting Tula's quilt and Tula Pink's quilt, and the most important thing about the quilt is her fabric, then that's where I'm going to be spending a lot of time. However, I'm going to be going around details in the print or pulling those out into the other area. In general, though, like if I'm working on a quilt, let's say for one of my kids, and it has prints and solids, if you can't see the quilting in the prints, I'm probably going to do something that I know for me is quicker and easier to quilt. Elongated swirl, I know I can whip those out pretty fast. Concentric swirls, though, I know for me take a little bit longer because of the traveling. So I'll say the concentric swirls for the solid fabric. The one option to that, or the one time that's not true, is if I'm learning a new design. If you're practicing a new design, busy fabric is the best place because you can't see it anyway. But I have to reiterate, that is just my preference. I don't want to spend a lot of time putting something really intricate and detailed in an area of the quilt that you're not going to be able to see. Unless, if it has a solid back, maybe, but I'm getting off topic. Do I ever combine ruler work with free motion quilt on the same quilt? All the time. All the time. I leave my ruler foot on my sewing machine and my long arm all the time because I like to pull my ruler in sometimes and then push it away and then go to my other quilting. So I think what's cool about it is you can just go from one to the next. And even when we looked at that whole combining designs, we saw some geometric and some back and forth and some curvy. It still looks nice because it all fits together. So yeah, I do. I use the two interchangeably. So hopefully that helps. But again, you'd have to kind of do what you like. I mentioned doing larger elements first. Do I ever do all the large elements and then weave back with a smaller, or always as I go? Okay, so for me, I always do it as I go. I think because of how I view things, when I get to the bottom of the quilt on my long arm, I want to be done. I don't want to have to go back, for the most part. If I'm on my sewing machine, I want to quilt that section while I'm there so I don't have to worry about coming back to it. But that's just how I like to approach it. Everybody is different. So if you're newer to quilting and you're on your sewing machine and you want to add your bigger elements, then come back, that's totally fine, right? I think you just do whatever you will do. But 99.99% of the time, I'm quilting that section and moving on as I go. So I was in a long arm training Monday night, and that's a question that came up too. Do I do all my stitch in the ditch and then come back? No, I stitch in my block, I quilt in my block, I quilt around it and move on. I just want to handle that while I'm there. But I think the more you do something, the more you find out what you prefer and what you like. And once you find out what you like, then you'll be able to move through with what makes you happy. I hope that makes sense. So great questions. I hope that you find this week's tutorials exciting. I hope you like quilting them. If you have questions and you're not watching live, no worries. You can leave them in the comments. I get on there from time to time and answer them. And don't forget to leave a comment to enter the giveaway. That will be over next week. So next week, we're actually going to see the last chunk of designs for our filler challenge, wavy line designs. Up to this point, we've been dealing with shapes that fit in small or medium or large, but now we're going to deal with designs that fit defined areas. So all these designs need set defined areas, and we're going to have fun creating different wavy line designs. I think you're going to love it. So that video hopefully will be out Tuesday, if not Wednesday, and I'll be back for another live chat next Thursday to answer your questions. So until then, everybody stay safe, happy quilting, and I will see you next week.